Today, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Jesse Alexander, who is a public historian based in Vienna, Austria. He holds an MA in modern history from the University of Vienna, where he focused on propaganda in World War One. And of course, that is one of the topics we are going to be covering because propaganda is a critical weapon of war of the modern Russian armed forces, not just in Ukraine, but also the what they call it, the sub-threshold war that's been waged against the West as well. Jesse's researched, written, hosted documentary films on 19th and 20th century conflict, including the Great War series, and like myself, dabbles in YouTube as well. But I'll let him give the full details to that. We're going to be talking about Jesse's experience in helping to fundraise for Ukraine, and also we're going to be talking about the Russo-Ukrainian war in a broader historical context. Now, before we jump in, a quick question here to everyone. Please do make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss any of the fantastic guests on the channel. Do write a comment. It helps the algorithm push these videos up. And of course, we want to expose these important messages to as many people as possible. And lastly, thank you to everybody who has been supporting our fundraiser, because the next trip to Ukraine is coming up. That is in mid-May. And as some of you know, we'll be running events in Lviv, in Kiev and Odessa as well. We've got some really exciting interviews queued up, but of course all of this takes money, and unfortunately I am not an oligarch, so any assistance the audience has given and can give is very, very gratefully received. Jesse, welcome to the channel.
Thanks very much for having me. I would say thankfully you're not an oligarch. Tends
Thankfully.
to have a little impact. It changes people in some ways.
Yeah, yes, it tends to. I know people who work in restaurants and stuff in the West End of London and Knightsbridge and posh areas, and yes, the phrase "I've never met a nice oligarch" kind of comes to mind. Um, if you want to maybe give the audience a little bit more background, of course, I say you dabble in YouTube, you're far, far more than that. Very high quality productions, very impactful work there. How did you get into it, and what is your sort of current output?
Well, I've always had a passion for history, and as you mentioned, I then did a couple of history degrees, and I wanted to return to that in my career, and I ended up finding a partner for that, the Real-Time History production company based in Germany, and I work with them for most of what I do, which is these two YouTube channels that we produce. The Great War is one, Real-Time History is the other, and there we deal almost exclusively with the history of war and the history of conflict of various kinds, ranging more or less from Napoleon up to, oh, probably the Great War on Terror. So we try to cover all those different bases. And I also work with a British production company and host an audio podcast about World War II called Both Sides of the Wire. So I went from a childhood history nerd to having the privilege of being able to be involved in bringing, hopefully, a well-researched, balanced version of what's often, sensitive topic about military conflict to a wider public. So that's what we try to do.
And of course, as someone who sort of binge watches anything on Second World War and indeed First World War as well, it seems that it's an almost infinite mine of information. You can never run out of themes on the Second War. Indeed, there are certain aspects of that war that still have not been covered, that still need to be researched.
Yeah, that's true. It is an inexhaustible mine. Now, of course, we do have to deal with some pragmatic limits and restrictions. We'd love to deal with certain topics, but we also have to make a living. So we need to balance the kind of more niche topics with ones that we know will be of particular interest to the audience. So it's a bit of a mix and match, sometimes a bit of a judgment call. And of course, to illustrate these, we need to have enough images. It's a visual medium. It's not a university lecture. So we need to make sure that what we put out as the final product is not only well-grounded history, but it's a well-rounded visual public history product that people are going to want to watch, that people are going to find visually interesting, as well as just intellectually interesting. So the availability of archival film clips or pictures and that sort of thing is also a factor in limiting the limitless historical material that there is.
And it's tricky, isn't it? Because and for the audience, bear with me. This is a little bit sort of nerdy here. Um, what I'm producing is closer to sort of maybe not sort of academic stuff in terms of the tone, as it were, but it's a bunch of talking heads essentially. There's very few visuals in there. And so the cost to produce it is relatively cheap. It's just sort of time, passion, energy, these kind of things. Whereas, yes, history topics get a lot more traffic, and I can see that, most videos are in the hundreds of thousands, some are even in the millions, which is absolutely incredible. But the amount of time it must take to produce an episode, for the audience, it can take me anything from an hour to a couple of hours, even to a couple of days to research an individual interview here, to set it up, record it, edit it, publish it, and so on. It can be as fast as it can take as little as 2 hours to produce a video, essentially, up to a couple of days. Because I do them in parallel, of course, it's possible to queue up, one or even multiple videos a day and do other stuff as well. So it's quite a, people ask, well, how do you maintain the output? Actually, if you get into a rhythm and you've got a process, it's actually not too difficult. But when you're producing those documentaries, the amount of research, structuring, script writing, editing, that surely is a far more onerous kind of task.
It is, and this is one of the reasons why we try to be transparent about that. At the end of each video, we explain that this is a business and five people's livelihoods plus family dependents for some of us depend on this, and it's an undertaking. There are five people working full time to produce those two channels, and our videos are usually in the range of 20 to 30 minutes. There are a few exceptions. If we want to treat a whole war as one video, it might be longer, or if we don't have enough visuals, we might shorten something. But more or less, we have 3 of those per month, which each one requires somewhere in the range of about 100 man hours or person hours. From the time I or my colleague Mark starts reading to the time that it gets posted and people start seeing it in their notification. So it's a big deal. And one of the most time-consuming aspects of that are the animations, the maps where armies are moving and borders are shifting. Periods like post First World War are absolute nightmares because there are years go by where lots of fighting is happening, but there are no determined borders. And so how do our animation guys handle that? We just had a big meeting about it yesterday. So there are tricks of the trades, but yes, it's a labor-intensive process. We're not generating the scripts via AI or ChatGPT, which is
That was going to be my next question there.
becoming
Whether
more
it,
common on
yeah,
YouTube,
yeah.
unfortunately. But yeah.
Is AI in any way a tool that can help research, or when you need historical accuracy, is it rather dangerous? Because the stuff it produces is highly plausible and very polished and often very well structured. But if there's an accuracy, you don't know which, whether it's 1%, 5%, 10%, you don't know which bit of that output is accurate or not. So you'd have to go back and double check everything, I'm sure, that it produces.
As far as I'm concerned, now maybe I'm a little bit old-fashioned, I don't know, but it's useless for research in its current form because, as you say, let's say the hallucinations are 1% or less than 1%, but you don't know which 1% that is. What if it's a very important statement that it makes? And as you say, the tone, it's so confident, it is so polished. I like that word that you chose. It sounds like it knows what it's talking about. The other element is, we feel that we've developed a reputation for serious history, not boring, but serious. I'd emphasize the distinction there, I hope. And that means turning to reputable publications, articles, books, that sort of thing. Not history.com or whatever other random, not that I'm trying to throw shade at any website that's called history.com. I think there actually is one, but we want peer-reviewed stuff. We want stuff from scholars, from experienced journalists, and so on and so forth. ChatGPT, as far as I know, draws from whatever it's been trained on, which is a huge mass of stuff. Some of it good, some of it completely useless, some of it that mindlessly repeats, myths about history that have been debunked. Some of it repeats disinformation that you can find on the internet, some of which is from Russia and some of which, of course, is perhaps from other sources as well. So we don't use it at all for our research. The one place that we use some AI tools is in helping us improve the quality of some visuals. So you might find an archival photograph that we'd like to use, but it's blurry or it's poor quality visually. And there are some AI tools that can kind of upscale that asset, as the lingo goes, and just improve the visual quality of it a bit. But we do not generate any images from scratch via AI because we feel like that would be unethical. So we won't do it.
Yeah. And that's extraordinary polluting. And, I've got a reasonably good eye for, say, Victorian images of architecture of London. I'm very familiar. And I can almost immediately spot or suspect when something's AI because it's too sharp for the period, or you're showing things in motion which would have been blurry using technology of the time. But of course, if you haven't, steeped yourself in imagery of a period, unfortunately, this stuff can be plausible. It makes me worried that in future years, we won't be able to tell the past from the imagined past.
Well, politically, we're already having some difficulties with that. So imagine if that becomes a part of daily life. And given how visual media is now so anchored in our daily understanding, in how information is conveyed, in how political information is conveyed, it's a huge concern. And I don't know exactly what it's going to lead to. I do know that a big part of what we want to do is not let that, at the current state of affairs, not let that have an impact on how we try to deal responsibly with history. Of course, we have to make choices in how we present things. We have to make editorial choices. We can be critiqued for that. And trust me, in the comments, we're very often critiqued for real or perceived editorial choices that we might make on what to include or not, or how to word something. But AI is not a part of that mix. And we feel like that's actually a calling card. Not only for us, there are many other good and responsible history creators on YouTube, but we want to define ourselves as, we don't generate things via AI, and you can trust that. You don't have to trust everything we say, of course, but you can trust that we're not doing that. And I think that is actually a significant selling point business-wise these days as well.
Absolutely right. And of course, that brings us very neatly into the use of propaganda, especially visual propaganda in wartime, because it's not just Russia that does this. And very early on, and perhaps the first sort of 10 episodes that I produced, I did reference something that I remembered from school, which is this sort of grainy footage of Polish cavalry attacking sort of panzers. Now, of course, when I was at school, that wasn't pointed out that was actually a piece of Nazi faked propaganda. We were shown that as if, like, yes, look at this, look at that sort of clash that took place. So I got very cautious about referencing anything that I think I recall from when I sort of studied. History in the past, I maybe fallen back into some of the habits of referencing, cross-referencing, and doing a little bit of research. And if I'm not quite sure, I simply don't mention something, which is a good habit, and it keeps the negative comments down as well. But faking footage is something that the Russians have taken to sort of the next level, But of course, it's happened throughout history. And when one thinks of one of the best pieces of footage of trench warfare in the First World War, which actually I think was recreated on Wimbledon Common, if I'm not mistaken, because they didn't have the footage to show to the public in newsreels of what it was like. But Russians seem to have taken these sort of visual propaganda to another level, including documentary propaganda, such as the film Russians at War. I don't know if you've been following that particular story, but I'd love to hear your views on the role of visual propaganda in wartime.
Well, it's important. Now, one of the trickier parts, propaganda is a little bit slippery, right? Because it plays sometimes with a grain of truth, sometimes not. It can be completely fabricated. But it also can work in unconscious ways. So it plays with unconscious assumptions that we might have, or cultural assumptions and associations that we have. So it can use different symbols and shapes and figures and references that we kind of automatically have an association with these things without having to deliberately think, I'm looking at this and I'm associating with this. Now, what I mean by that is you can create an image or a cartoon, for example, that plays with, I don't know, Zelensky's physical features. And we know that that's associated with stereotypes about Jews, for example, right? Or you can paint someone with different colors, dark versus light. And we know that in the Western world anyway, our brains associate darkness with something negative, danger, evil, what have you. So these things can kind of work in that way. I remember a documentary that came out a few years ago in Russia as well, a documentary about the Second World War. Of course, current Russian propaganda, in some ways, it's quite clever and subtle. And in other ways, they just beat you over the head with it. In this particular documentary, they were discussing and blaming, of course, the Western powers for the Munich Agreement in 1938, this appeasement of Hitler, which, of course, there's a lot to criticize there. That's the grain of truth that they're working with in this case. But, of course, they portray it as the innocent Soviet Union was looking on and had no choice but to then make a self-preservation deal with the Nazis after that. And as they're describing this, they showed footage of the Berlin Zoo in the 1930s that had received a new seal. And they were talking about Chamberlain and Daladier going to Munich and meeting with Hitler, while they're showing the zookeeper getting the seal to do tricks. Right, so this is a kind of crude, but sometimes if you repeat it often enough, effective method. I think the more pernicious side to Russian disinformation is the more subtle stuff, where certain narratives can be promoted. The Russians don't even have to directly pay they do directly pay certain influencers, as we know from a big case in the US from a few months ago. But they can sow certain narratives that then get taken up by other people who might not realize the origin of them or who they benefit. Some people on the farther left of the political spectrum are looking for ways to be critical of the capitalist system in the West, for example. And then there are these convenient narratives. But those can also serve a different purpose beyond just critiquing our democratic societies in a legitimate way, right? So I think there's a few different strands of disinformation at work of different kinds, of course.
And of course, the Second World War, which is a nice sort of intersection with a lot of your research, the mythology, the historical mythology that's been propagated by the Russian side over decades is extraordinary. We've got the 9th of May Victory Day parade coming up. And I think that's a useful reminder that when Russia celebrates this, it's 1941 to 1945, as if nothing happened before then.
Right.
They're just an innocent victim of Nazi aggression rather than potentially the co-conspirator in starting the Second World War, in planning the Second World War, and then ultimately the Germans didn't benefit from that plan. The Russians did. They managed to occupy Eastern Europe, which, if one's super cynical, if one believes certain KGB sources, was the plan all along. Divide and conquer is one of the theories. Now, that's highly, highly speculative, but these forays into grand strategy are not alien to Russian politics. They do think on a very big, broad canvas, and they don't consider the costs, the humane costs, in the way that a Western government would do. Therefore, that kind of thinking seems completely alien to us. It's not completely divorced, I think, from how Putin sees the world as a giant chess game. A million Russian soldiers. Well, what's that to lose on, when you're looking on a canvas, historical canvas of this kind of scale? We're not used to thinking in those terms, are we?
That's true. I do think it's worth pointing out that, various Russian dominated states, be it the Tsarist Empire, be it the Federation today, be it the Soviet Union, they're not alone in playing geopolitical chess, of course. The British Empire did that as well. The Americans do that, and so on. But of course, there's a particular way that these Russian dominated states have gone about that. They do sometimes make calculations about human life and want to achieve things on the cheap, right? I don't think it would come as a surprise if we would say, well, Putin did not expect this war. He did expect something easier with less loss of human life. Now, once things got out of hand, human life goes out the window as a consideration. In a similar way, perhaps for Stalin, who obviously was not that worried about human life in general, as we know, his legacy of tens of millions of victims. Obviously, when he's making the Nazi-Soviet pact with the Germans, he's also not thinking, well, in a few years, if they turn on me, we'll lose 27 million Soviet citizens, not only Russians, of course, but Soviet citizens of all different groups. And then we're going to dominate half of Europe. He wanted to dominate half of Europe, a little bit less than he eventually did, on the cheap, by making a deal with the Germans and striking at weaker victims like Finland, like the Baltic states, Romania, and of course, Poland when they invaded in common. So there's a bit of a balancing act. It's not purely the sort of inhuman side, although one of the themes, I think, and Professor Stephen Kotkin pointed this out, he's a renowned scholar of Russian history, that Russian-dominated states repeatedly make the same kind of strategic choices when faced with certain different international situations. And those choices very often go towards, or generally, with very brief exceptions in history, go towards expanding territory as a way of increasing their perception of security and their prestige for a great power, relying on an idea of Russia as having a special mission in the world. This is kind of what I think where you were going as well, with some of these big ideas, big thinking. Well, in the 19th century, there's an idea that Russia has a special spiritual mission in the world. Then, of course, the USSR cloaked itself in the idea of an international mission in the world. And now I think it's fair to say that the Russian Federation government also thinks that it has a special mission to save the world from the evils of Western decadence and so on and so forth. And a part of achieving all that is power and expansion. There are some geographical elements that we can say influence this. Russia has historically considered itself to be in a vulnerable position sometimes, with powers on different sides of it. I don't subscribe to the idea that Russia has always been surrounded by enemies. This is a fiction, of course. Russian states have had many alliances with many neighbors. Even NATO's border with Russia is only a fraction of its total total borders. So there's no
And
always in history.
initiated many
Sure, sure,
conflicts.
absolutely.
Unlike Peskov, who'll say, "Yeah, we've never attacked anybody. That's not what we're
Well,
like."
they didn't get that big by accident, right? This is another cherished myth in Russia. Now, Russia's not the only state that has myths, of course, but they're the one who started this war that we're talking about today. So we'll focus on that. This idea that they created their empire simply because all those neighboring peoples, all those indigenous peoples in Siberia and Central Asia just in a friendly manner accepted union with Russia. And so, I mean, this is, anybody who thinks about history in general terms, this is not how things go. You can have more violence versus less, but it's not a plausible narrative unless, of course, you're writing a Russian history textbook.
Indeed, and of course, some, as I was speaking to a Ukrainian service person yesterday, Russian literature is replete with far more accurate descriptions of the violence and methods of this imperial control. One thinks of the works of Tolstoy and Lermontov, where some of those imperial mechanics are actually sort of discussed, or some aspects of it are shown. And yeah, they're brutish and violent. I mean, we shouldn't get away from the impression that this wasn't a sort of peaceful assimilation. In many cases, it was extreme violence, some of it, of course, of a genocidal character as well.
Yes, this is true. I mean, even instances that are not as well known, like the Circassian genocide of the 1860s, when Russia was expanding to the Caucasus region and basically wiped out and expelled a huge proportion of this ethnic minority, the Circassians, most of whom ended up in the Ottoman Empire after that. Of course, as a historian, I want to make sure that we're responsible here. And Russian states are not the only ones to have expanded with imperial violence, not the only ones to have committed genocides, and so on and so forth. Ukraine also has its myths, its nationalist myths. It also has swept some of the darker side of its history as a nation under the carpet. But all roads lead to, the war that's going on right now is pretty much as close to a one-way street as I think we can reasonably get. And I know there's a huge debate about the cause of the war, but I think the far more convincing argument is clearly that Russia's responsible for it.
Yes, I think so. And it's interesting to examine the motivations behind it because it does seem that at some point, I mean, you mentioned, in respect to Putin, this sense of exceptionalism. There comes a point, doesn't there, where you put these things forward because they work in manipulating people. They're good tools of control of a population. But at some point, you may even start to believe your own propaganda. Um, I suspect that Putin, especially during the COVID phase, descended into a phase where prior to that, he may have been using some of these narratives just because they're useful. But then it starts to become kind of blurred. Do we see that similar process with the Nazis of fabricating propaganda and then believing it? Or is that slightly different? Were the Nazis far more, radically ideological, full of sort of, certain prejudices right from the start?
I think, there are some similarities in how Putin, weaponizes history, views Russians as a sort of, in some ways, superior nation. But at the same time, there is a discussion about to what extent we can call Putin's Russia ideological and to what extent he's sort of a mafia style kleptocratic opportunist who is cobbling together a convenient array of political and ideological ideas and methods that are not as coherent. I don't know exactly where I stand on that question, to be honest, because there's a lot of interesting takes pushing in either direction. I do think there is some ideological coherence that, to my mind, as hopefully an informed or reasonably informed observer, that there is some ideological coherence that rests on anti-Western ideas in opposition to Western quote unquote civilization, that Russia is its own civilization that has a special mission, especially a historical mission. It seems like history is a centerpiece of the justification for the war, but also the justification for this supposed Russian exceptionalism, Russian role in the world to restore what they see as historical justice. And historical justice essentially means maximalist Russian imperial goals. And that, Putin wrote this famous slash infamous long article about the historical unity of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. I mean, just the idea of that doesn't fit with history. Over the long course of history, Russia and Ukraine included, but not exclusively, there are different identities. There are different states. There are different ways of thinking about one's identity. Those are not directly related necessarily to genetics or historical overlap of states or even language necessarily, right? Most Irish people in the Republic of Ireland only speak English, and yet they would not consider themselves Englishmen. In fact, I'd probably get myself in a lot of trouble if I were to describe them that way.
I
And so
suggested it's something worse. I get a punch in the face, surely.
you see? And so even if there are, and there are, Ukrainians who have Russian as their mother tongue, it doesn't mean that those people are identifying as Russians, that they want to be Russians, and so on and so forth. So this is something that's a natural critique, a natural question for people who've had more experience with historical methods or historical thought. But in the public discussions and online, you hear these ideas as though they're the gospel sometimes. And I think that kind of false common sense or false, I don't know, old wives' tales or what have you, from the Russian side, they can be effective. They can be effective. I mean, you have Witkoff, the special envoy, saying, equating language with some of Russia's claims. And this is, to anybody who knows something about Ukraine, I'm not the world's greatest expert on Ukraine by any means. But if you know some Ukrainians, or if you've been to Ukraine, or if you've read a couple of history books by Ukrainian historians, there's no way to just equate language with the identity. It's a big pillar of national identity for nearly everyone, including Ukraine, but it's not a one-to-one.
And there are many other factors, many other cultural factors. There are many other, I would say, sources of people's sense of their literature identity, whatever it happens to be, which add nuance and diversity to that, which again makes those differences. But this is something that fascinated me early on. And, I was talking about this with Jay Beglin some time back as well. And that is, we look at some of these narratives that say Witkoff is saying. We look at the questions, for instance, that Lex Friedman asked during his infamous interview with Zelenskyy, and we think, because these phrases align with Russian propaganda, because these phrases and way of framing the world is to the benefit of Russia, this must all be manufactured by the Kremlin, etc. I think that's to ignore some of the dangerous aspects of it. When I was in Russia in the 90s, I had a little notebook because it struck me that, yes, you have historical mythology everywhere. And one of my reasons for going for Russia was to understand more of English history and identity, what was mythologized and what wasn't, by providing a contrast. But what it struck me is just the sheer scale and breadth and actually purpose of historical myths that I encountered in Russia. It just felt odd. It felt very, very odd. And, I couldn't decide whether it was organic or not, but certainly in conversations with ordinary people, you would hear the same things over and over and over, translated into their own tone, translated into their own contexts, with own personal experiences layered on. But when you dig down, there's this core of mythologies, which, if you just think about them for a little bit, just don't stack up at all. But they're hardwired into people. I haven't gotten to a conclusion on that, but I'm pretty sure that many of these are a combination of manufactured and organic. Because of course, Russia hasn't had an organic media for decades and decades and decades. There was a small window where it sort of started to emerge. But if you discount the sort of 8 years or so where it had a non-state influenced sort of media, and even then it's very oligarch driven. It didn't really evolve out of the oligarch phase of media ownership. Um, it's quite easy, I think, for the state to take what's there and to warp it and change it and create these narratives that fulfill its purpose. One of those purposes, of course, is to persuade the Russian people that they are almost genetically and culturally impossible for the seeds of democracy to be planted. That's the first stage. The second stage is then to say, well, democracy isn't real. And the third stage, well, if it's not real, then democracy is just a Western plot to control and destroy us. So it's an interesting process of planting the narratives, warping narratives that are already there, and essentially weaponizing any sort of anecdotal discourse around history.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point that, the Kremlin is not making every post that is somehow in harmony with a part of the official Russian narrative. This is not, it's not how ideas develop. It's not how cultures work. It's not how our historical memory works. It's way messier than that. And that's, I think, part of the intractability of the problem we have with information and disinformation in our society now, with the uncontrolled way of disseminating on social media. It's not all top down. There is an organic element to it in a couple of different ways. I think you have now an organic incentive for some people online to be able to make a business model out of propagating these types of ideas. And on the other hand, as I mentioned before, some of these ideas come from, let's say, have a grain of truth, start from something that's kind of legitimate. Every society, every country has its failings, has its hypocrisies, has its national myths, and you can critique those from the outside. So, have different Western countries acted in hypocritical ways about human rights or democracy? Yes, of course. There's no question. But that then can become the convenient narrative of, well, this is all a fiction. We're going to throw the baby out with the water, so to speak, and democracy doesn't really mean anything anyway, and that's why we don't need it here, and that's perhaps why, it might be justified in Russian eyes to say Ukraine is not a democracy, and so on and so forth. Of course, history is a bit similar to that, in the sense that the Russian narrative, you can go back to, say, the period of the Russian Revolution and start to question what happens there. Whereas, there were attempts at an independent Ukrainian state with a fair degree of support amongst the population, which were militarily crushed. And yet that kind of gets glossed over, right? You can say, there was no such thing as Ukraine, or Lenin created Ukraine. And well, that's not a realistic interpretation of what a national identity is, and certainly not a realistic understanding of what happened in those years when there were attempts at Ukrainian independence, more than one, in fact.
You have direct experience, of course, and I think wherever possible for a historian, having that sort of first-hand experience on the ground, as it were, is absolutely critical to then be able to come at written sources with some sort of lived experience, if it's at all possible. Of course, at some events it's not. In this instance, what's your association with Ukraine? And I know you've been crowdsourcing sort of vehicles, which of course is something we've done on this channel as well. How did that come about, and what was that experience like for you?
Well, I first visited Ukraine many years ago as a tourist, before even the occupation of Crimea. So I had a certain interest in Eastern Europe because of my interest in military history and conflict. Unfortunately, that region has been on the unluckier side in the 20th century, especially. But when the war broke out, I felt that I needed to do something. Some people say, and I don't agree with this, but it's a common opinion, I think, that if you're a historian, you should be objective and you shouldn't take any positions on current day events. And I would say, well, yes, my work is history, but I am a citizen. I am a person who I hope has some values and principles. And that means that I should, when I want to, be able to take a position, or I have a duty to take a position on these types of questions. So right away, when the war began, I decided I wanted to do something to help Ukraine. And eventually that led within a few months to a partnership with a Vienna-based NGO called YOUkraine, Y-O, Ukraine. And they were coordinating some deliveries of humanitarian aid, but also vehicles, ambulances, pickup trucks, things that are necessary for all sorts of different non-combat related uses. So first we partnered up and fundraised for an ambulance, which I then drove with a volunteer of theirs to Ukraine. They found a partner organization that needed the vehicle to evacuate casualties. And then we partnered with some other history YouTubers, some of them from the UK as well. And together then we had a few projects, few campaigns, let's say, where in total we delivered 10 pickup trucks over the course of last year and a little bit before that. The last delivery was a 5-truck convoy in November. We don't deliver them to the front line. I'm not trying to paint myself as, a maverick hero of any kind. I would be very afraid to be within range of Russian artillery or rockets. Of course, everywhere in the country is within range of something. And my first trip, I was in Lviv to hand over the ambulance, and it did get hit with several missiles. This was before the mass use of the Shahid drones. So anyway, to make a long story short, we've been able together to deliver 10 plus vehicles to the Ukrainians who need them for all sorts of different purposes. Mobility is very important in war and also in saving and evacuating casualties of war. And it's been an interesting experience to get to know the country and its people better. I have some personal connections to Ukraine as well through family and some friends, but it's really been a valuable human experience to see how resilient the people are, how normal life has remained, at least in the western half of the country. I've not been to the eastern half of the country, where obviously it's a much more difficult situation. And also it's been illuminating in terms of some of these myths about Ukraine that one hears. Yes, they struggle with corruption, not as much as Russia. So why would we make that a centerpiece of assessing, the guilt for the war or worthiness of support, etc.? It makes no sense. But at the same time, civil society there is very, very strong. You have so many people volunteering, so many kind of grassroots organizations, even if sometimes it's because of the weakness or lack of trust with government organizations. It's amazing. I mean, I wish that Western countries like my home country of Canada or my adoptive country of Austria had such an engaged citizenry. It's not to say every Ukrainian is an engaged citizen. Obviously, that's not the case, but it's so strong that it's really, really admirable. And there's such a kind of openness that I'm not trying to purely idealize Ukraine, but under these circumstances, these absolutely terrible circumstances, to see the kind of openness there, to see how they, welcome us as kind of clueless foreigners who don't know a lot about the country. Most of our group of foreign volunteers didn't have a lot of experience with Ukraine. and just that openness there. I hesitate to say, oh, they were so thankful. I mean, because I don't think that's a very useful way to sort of paint them as well. They're just grateful recipients. I mean, they are defending us, in my opinion. They're defending
Absolutely. Yeah.
the safety of other parts of Europe. And so, trying to help them is just the responsible thing to do, in my opinion, as an individual and collectively. So that whole experience was a formative one, and really, I think, gave me an insight into what war means for people away from the actual combat. And of course, things happen. We just got a video last week from one of the groups who received one of the vehicles that one of them got hit by a Russian FPV drone, got hit right in the engine bay, and it's scrapped now. So what we're doing now is we're launching a small follow-up campaign to try to replace that vehicle. So that's where we're at the moment.
And to draw the historical analogy there, I hope rather future studies that will be done will demonstrate that the sort of civic society component that you're talking about there, and yes, not everyone is participating in that, but there's a critical threshold of enough people to make a change. We saw that in Maidan. We saw that in the 2014 sort of rabble, little green men Russian invasion of Donbass, which was halted in its tracks by the involvement of civic society. Government was too weak, too disorganized. The army was too run down to mount a full response. And it seems that time after time, I've talked to people who say it was civic society mobilization that stopped Russia's first invasion in its tracks. It was civic society motivation that's made the real critical difference in this full-scale war as well. Now, of course, I think at the end of the war, as always happens, central government will try to right its role as being more significant. And it may well, and actually I've seen evidence that it already does this, it may well try to take some of the, some of the honor for achieving certain things, which actually were non-governmental initiatives. The estimate I've seen at the moment is anything from sort of 20 all the way through to 40% when it comes to monetary, material, human input into a whole variety of factors that affect Ukrainian resilience in the war. And of course, what is perhaps more fascinating and sort of relevant to your channel and the study of the Second World War is that the evolution of technology is being driven by this extraordinary conjunction between the entrepreneurial tech sector, civil society, and people who've joined the military from those spheres, and it's transforming warfare not just in technology but in the whole, I would say, human aspect of organization of how that takes place. Very, very different in some ways to, say, the First World War. Very, very, state-driven sort of process. Here we're looking at sort of incredible devolved process. What would be the analogy in history, if indeed you can find one? I mean, do we have to look back at Napoleon and the sort of first use of sort of massed armies, or maybe the English Civil War and the parliamentary side that has a combination of ideology, high-minded ideals combined with sort of mass mobilization and new techniques of war?
I mean, that's a tall order for a historical parallel because, of course, every historical situation, is unique. History it's not cyclical in that way. It doesn't repeat all the time. These are some ideas that are floating around out there in the internet that are not borne out by the state of the historical profession, let's say. I do think that we tend to underestimate sometimes, as far as the First World War goes, some of the civic engagement. There's a big debate about how much was it coercion and how much was it consent in terms of the populations, and there's a back and forth about that. There were a lot of citizen initiatives in the First World War. People bought war bonds, people raised funds to help Belgian refugees, Serbian refugees, etc., or even Russian refugees as well. In the Russian Empire, of course, there were fundraisers for them in Allied countries. But I think that in a way, I don't want to stretch this analogy too far. But if you think in part about a situation like, well, I'll take two different ones and we can maybe see which one might have a little more weight to it. I'm shooting from the hip here, as they say. Yugoslavia in the Second World War is pretty much the only state that's able to liberate itself, primarily under its own steam, using its own resources for violence against the German occupation. Well, originally Italian as well, but then by the time the end of the war comes around, it's just German. The Red Army doesn't have to liberate all of Yugoslavia. Of course, it helps that they're in the area, that they're not far. But Yugoslav partisans are the primary driving force to throwing the Germans out. And this is kind of a unique case in the Second World War. In another way, one could maybe point to some parallels with the French Revolution. I'm a little bit out of my depth as far as where I'm better read, but you have an idea. You have a new idea of a nation with rights for its citizens. It doesn't mean that that was uppermost of mind for every last French peasant who got conscripted, because then, of course, the revolution takes a bit of a different turn, as we know, and becomes more imperial, less democratic. But you do have these kind of ideas that motivate people. And those ideas, they can kind of be push or pull, let's say. You can have an idea of, we have this Ukrainian identity. We want to be independent. We want to have our own state. The same kind of idea that was motivating Ukrainians in 1917, 18, 19, when there were several attempts at an independent Ukrainian state. I think there's a parallel there. Those attempts at Ukrainian states don't get support from Britain, France, or the US. It's not considered vital to their interests. They're distracted by other situations, trying to make peace and establish a new order at the end of the First World War. And so these Ukrainians fighting for their independence are eventually overwhelmed, right, by the forces of Bolshevik Russia, to a lesser extent, the Polish Second Republic as well in the Western side. So there are a few parallels that we can think of. Sometimes there's a certain value. It's a bit difficult to apply anti-colonial struggles to the situation in Ukraine. There are some parallels, right? Russia was an imperial power. It colonized parts of today's Ukraine, founded certain cities there, industrialized them because it was engaged in this, looking for resources, looking to expand its power in the 18th century. So there are lots of potential parallels, I think, as well in the way that some societies resisted oppression from outside, resisted imperial oppression. But since I don't want to, bite off more than I can chew, I won't go into the details because I'm not an anti-colonial historian by trade, right?
That's a highly specialist area, of course, isn't it? In terms of scale as well, this is something that I've trotted this out, saying that the war in Ukraine is on a scale not seen since the Second World War, etc. I mean, the fact is, of course, that many of the place names will be familiar from the Second World War, and of course, it's taking history back to Ukraine has been the crucible of a lot of historical events. Just because we don't pay a huge amount of attention to, or not enough attention to, the Eastern Front in the First World War, doesn't mean this wasn't an absolutely significant kind of battleground. It was at the center, really, of course, of the Russian Civil War as well. Again, so complex that very few people sort of, follow the intricacy of that. Is it right to say, is it accurate to say that this is not just the largest scale conventional war since the Second World War, but also one which perhaps has the greatest sort of political implications, especially in terms of changes in the world order, the security architecture, the transatlantic alliance, and all these kind of things?
I think there's quite a bit to that. I don't think it's an exaggeration to assess it in those directions. I would say one exception in a way to the idea that it's the largest war since World War II. The Second Congo War, which is not necessarily very high on many of our radars, doesn't, it's
Not
not
what I
top of
thought you were going
mind
to
all the
say
time,
there.
right?
Yes.
This is in the late 90s, early 2000s, a massive war involving neighboring countries in the Congo, which cost something along the lines of 3 or 4 million lives. So that scale, on the human scale wise, that may be the biggest one since World War II. But as far as Europe is concerned, it's without question the largest war since World War II. And it is maybe in some ways potentially the most consequential conflict for us in Europe and North America since the Second World War, because it's not just about capturing a few oblasts for Russia, right? It's about these bigger ideas. It's about an attempt to revise the world order that has not been perfect, that has not been 100% stable since World War II. It had a complete modification in the early 1990s, of course, with the end of the Cold War. At the same time, much of the architecture of the post-World War II world stayed mostly intact. You have NATO as a major factor. You have the US as the single most important superpower involved in different places. You have new trade patterns that come. You have a different type of multilateralism that emerges. And now all that may be in tatters already, and we'll only fully realize that in some time from now. But at the very least, it's on unbelievably shaky ground. And the Ukraine war is the catalyst for this. This is the heart of this, because if it goes Russia's way, now how we would define victory is obviously quite a tricky question. But if Russia is able to, let's say, fully achieve its goals in Ukraine, it means that it's closer to achieving its overall goal, which is a complete revision of the balance of power in the world. And they're open about that. It's not some secret that they're keeping. In their speeches, Lavrov or Putin or whoever, they say, we want a multipolar world where we are fully sovereign, as they put it, which essentially means we can do what we like and we can dominate who we want and we can invade who we want. That's their, I think it's fair to say that's their idea of their conception of sovereignty.
They call it sovereign democracy, don't they? Which is neither democracy nor is it a classical definition of sovereignty. It's might makes right, essentially.
And the even trickier element to this, the element that I think makes it even more unstable, is now the US has changed its approach to the order of the world as well. Now, there are many, many instances where we can be critical of the US and its relationship to its own world order that it had. Iraq 2003 comes to mind, of course, breaking its own so-called rules-based order. But nonetheless, the basic architecture was still there and supported by the US with more influence than any other single state. No question about that. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But with the new administration in Washington, there is a new approach. And so even the previous kind of guarantor of most of that international order, despite the exceptions and mistakes and crimes and what have you, even the guarantor, former guarantor, is now saying, well, we're not so sure about that. In fact, we want to change this part or that part. And, you have Vance even referring to, let's say, referring indirectly to the desirability of regime changes in Europe, right? Not threatening to carry it out directly, but basically saying, if you're not ideologically aligned with us, why would we have such a close association? Why would we have a stake in this order? Is essentially what he said in his Munich speech. So we're in a period that's, on the one hand, it's hard to assess how far it's going to go. Things could come back into a bit more of stability, but I think the trend is towards instability, and that seems fairly clear. How far that will go, we don't know, but I think that's the core of what Russia wants to achieve is a rewriting of a reordering of international relations. And they're not the only ones now, right? China, in its own way, it's not as interested in instability as Russia is in some ways, but it also wants to revise the order. And now, in its own way, so does the US to some extent. We'll see to what extent they push that. And that's a quite a dangerous situation. That is, and I'm not saying we're headed for World War III. I don't want anybody out there to misinterpret this. But if you look at a situation like the 1930s, you have guarantors of the order that are weakened or divided. So you have Britain and France that are divided amongst themselves about what they should do with Germany after the First World War, and also too weak to uphold the new order because they were so exhausted after their victory. You have the US that sort of withdraws from upholding the order that was its suggestion in the first place by Wilson, creating a certain vision for the post-war order. And then you have revisionist powers who are not interested, who want to upend the order, like Germany and the Soviet Union and Italy and Hungary in the 1930s. You might say we also had a multipolar great power competition period in the lead up to the First World War, where you have a power like Germany that says, well, we're worried about the future. We think we might not have as much power in the future, so we're willing to risk potentially starting a war. We're willing to take much more risky, aggressive diplomatic moves in order to achieve that, because we have this fear of what the future might hold and our place in the order. And I think Russia probably did have some fears about its role in a future order because of economic stagnation, because of demographic decline, because of potentially what Ukraine might become after the Maidan revolution and a renewal of Ukrainian democracy and sovereignty, that these are things that Russia, doesn't want. And that involves not just Ukraine, but its place in the world. And so I'm not trying to scare everybody out there by saying it's going to lead to World War III. We don't know. I certainly hope not. I think there are things that we can do to make that less likely. One of those would be supporting Ukraine with as much as we can. But if you look, there are some parallels where you have multipolar great power competition, fearing about the future, causing sort of preemptive actions, or you have guarantors of an international system that are unable or unwilling to maintain the stability of that system, which leaves it open to aggressive revisionist powers. And there's a lot of ingredients in those recipes in the world around us today.
And this is one of the interesting insights I got, because we can easily dismiss, the Kremlin policy as just pure imperial aggression. But actually, paranoia, I think, is one of the things you mentioned there, or hinted at. Paranoia is a key part of Russian statecraft, unfortunately. And when you have a sort of vertical structure, and like Putin, you're isolated in the Kremlin for decades, surrounded by sycophants, which that process gets more and more intense as critical voices get pushed out and ignored. It's easy to see how paranoia about the outside world, and indeed his lack of experience. He's never actually lived in a Western country. Yes, he's lived in East Germany, but I think as a KGB officer living in the Soviet Union in a sort of backwater of the GDR is very different from living in a pluralistic, open Western society. So you combine that sort of perhaps ignorance of a lived experience of the West with the extreme sort of paranoia of that elite. It's kind of easy then to see how some of these miscalculations, or what seem to us absurd geopolitical ideas, come about. And it's not necessarily all artifice. I remember talking to someone who's a Russian opposition journalist, but who at some point did get to speak to Peskov and others away from the cameras, off the record. And she attests that the level of paranoia is off the scale in our terms. So, for instance, we think of sanctions as the inevitable consequence of their aggression in, say, Crimea. We see it as a mechanistic process rather than something that is targeting the DNA of the Russian state, as it were. They see it differently. By this particular individual's account, the belief was prevalent amongst Putin's circle that sanctions were inevitable. Whether we went to war or not, the West has got it in for us. You know, they want to destroy our mode of governance. They've done this, that, and the other in order to bring that about. It's inevitable. So we might as well, maybe that's justifying it. But I think some of that element of paranoia is genuine.
Well, I think that it's also, yeah, fairly widely shared. Now, obviously, opinion polls and things in Russia are very difficult to assess the validity of them. But just anecdotally, I traveled in Russia on a couple of occasions. Very, very valuable experience, very interesting experience, all the way to Buryatia, for example, close to the Mongolian border, and down to the Caucasus and to Chechnya. This is obviously all pre 2022. And I stayed in hostels, local hostels in dormitories where regular Russians who were traveling would stay. And some of those conversations, my Russian's not fully fluent, but I can manage in a friendly conversation more or less. And that was quite intriguing. One of the moments that will stick with me that's related to paranoia, of course, I had all sorts of different conversations, and some of them were anti-Putin, and some of them were ambiguous, and some of them had different opinions. But a friend of a friend of a friend, let's say, offered to drive me around in the Caucasus. And so we spent a couple of days. He very generously, fed me and drove me around, showed me the sights and things. We went to Grozny. We went around Dagestan and Ingushetia a little bit. And of course, we talked about politics. And I asked, how are things here? Have things calmed down? Obviously, there have been terror attacks by local Islamic terrorists in that region over the past few decades. And I asked him, what do you think's behind it, right? Well, how did this come about that there are some Islamic acts of terror in this region? And he said, oh, it's the Americans. They are behind this, right? And he said, I can't be sure. I don't have proof, but I really think it's the Americans. And of course, this is kind of preposterous. It's not like the Americans are uninterested in Russia. It's not like they haven't had in the past anyway. Now we'll see. But of course, they've taken actions against Russian interests. So have other states that oppose Russian policy. But the idea that in a remote peripheral region of Russia where you have a local Islamic insurgency, that the Americans are behind this, it just kind of boggles the mind. It doesn't pass, for me as an outsider, or us perhaps as outsiders, it just doesn't pass the common sense test. And yet, it seems logical. It passes their common sense test. So there is a certain degree of paranoia, I think, that's entered the public consciousness beyond even the regime, which, that's a problem if we hope that one day Russians will adopt a different attitude towards this government.
Absolutely. It's almost like I think of it as an onion, you peel away and peel away and peel away, and there will always be, so I'll cut that up. I think of it a bit like an onion. It's you peel away, and there's always another layer of narrative underneath. I remember a sort of ardent critic of Putin's regime, someone who's since fled, and they'll agree with you on a certain level about everything. And then finally you think, yes, we had a breakthrough, and they say something, yes, but ultimately, it's all NATO's fault, or NATO's just as culpable. And so there's different narratives that work at different layers for different people at different times. And I think that's, to hark back so maybe sort of close that out. You sort of mentioned that right at the start, that this propaganda is highly malleable. The fact that different propaganda narratives don't have to form some logically coherent whole when placed side by side, that's not the point. It's a discordant choir, but each note is designed to, to get into somebody's ear and to manipulate them. And that's a very difficult one to counter. The last thing here, because I know I've been very greedy with your time. Historians never like to be asked to make any kind of predictions, but it does at least seem to me that we've hit an extraordinary military arms race, which has resulted in a kind of stalemate, or at least superficially a stalemate. To maintain that stalemate actually requires a lot of work on both sides to evolve their technologies and techniques. So it's in some ways it does bear comparison with First World War. And I was put right by that on that by Sir Richard Shirreff yesterday when I described the First World War as a stalemate throughout. He said, no, there was a point in the Amiens campaign where combined arms techniques started to emerge from the warfare and caused a breakthrough. And of course, I think what we're seeing is something similar in Ukraine, which is a furious development of technology with the trench system, with this extraordinary battlefield transparency. At this point, that suggests to me that the outcome may be similar to the First World War, in that we could see a precipitous collapse of one side or the other at this point. Whichever side gets exhausted first and can no longer, maintain the fight. At this point, my money's on Russia actually being the exhausted party there. But again, are we falling into a historical trap by comparing this to the outcome of the First World War?
Well, maybe this is not the answer you were looking for, but I'd say yes and no. It is the First World War is an interesting comparison to make because you do have, as you mentioned, certain elements, some type of stalemate. Of course, the Eastern Front was less stalematey in the First World War, right? The force to space ratio was much less, more cavalry could be used, there were sweeping offensives and so on. But of course, the visuals that we see, the reports from the front line of, okay, the Russians are gaining, very, very slowly territory at high cost. It's become, in some senses, an attritional struggle, as the First World War did. The defensive has the advantage because of the state of the technology. In the First World War, it was barbed wire, better firepower for the defensive, and aerial photography, which is not entirely dissimilar to the drones that we see,
Back to the
exposing
transparency, aren't we? This
exactly
revolutionary transparency of the
exposing
battlefield.
any movement of any forces whatsoever. And of course, the First World War was an attritional struggle. Now, to a certain extent, all wars that last a little bit longer in modern period have an attritional element to them. But if you have this conjuncture of technological development that gives the defensive the advantage, the attritional element becomes much more important, as it did in the First World War. And yes, you're right. Very few were predicting a full Central Powers collapse, even in the fall of 1918. So I, of course, worry that there are things happening under the surface that will then come out quite suddenly. Not necessarily. We could be in for more grinding and then a ceasefire and a partial peace and then more grinding. It's difficult to say. That is one potential outcome. But yes, I worry about the scenario that my worry is that the Ukrainian side is weaker than it may appear, and that a partial collapse may happen. I hope that doesn't happen. I'm not saying my money is on that, but that's the scenario that I worry about, and that's the scenario that happened to the smaller side, the less numerous side in the First World War, right? The solution to that, other than some sort of peace deal, if everyone involved can swallow the compromises, it's not for me to give my opinion to Ukrainians on what they should compromise on or not. Obviously, I hope for the best case outcome for Ukraine, but the the way to hopefully mitigate that danger, in my opinion, is firepower, is to be able to inflict really multiple times the losses on the larger opponent, right? And I worry that we're not there, because although the Russians are taking higher casualties, partly because of the tactics they use, which are reckless as far as casualties are concerned, and partly because they've run out of some of their kit and they're using, motorbikes and electric scooters and donkeys and all this sort of thing. But in an attritional struggle, it doesn't matter if you're using donkeys if the opponent is weakening faster than you are. And it's hard for us to judge. We don't get as much information about the inside potential cracks in Ukraine's situation as much as we speculate about the Russian ones. And so that's my concern. I think if we were able to fully equip Ukraine with many more complex weapon systems, which the US has and could easily and at a very low cost to itself provide to Ukraine, but doesn't, and didn't fully under Biden either. It's not just a Trump thing. But that's the way to ensure that a positive for Ukraine and for the rest of us, in my view, outcome of this, of what's become an attritional war, would be possible, would be more likely. I know that that's a bit of cold comfort because that's out of our hands, and the political situation and the industrial situation is very tricky in every other Western country except the US. But to me, that's how you try to help the smaller combatant in an attritional struggle. And one of the reasons why Germany lost the First World War is because it wasn't able to do that. They did inflict more losses on the Allies, significantly more losses. But in the end, they still collapsed under the long-term pressure of an enemy that had more people and had more resources. And I don't want that to happen to Ukraine, and I don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Jesse, it's been such a tremendous pleasure talking. There's a lot to take away there, to use in other interviews and to sort of explore and do further reading on. I hope the audience share my thrill at this conversation. For today, though, thank you so much.
Thank you.